Michael Forsberg. I'm a conservation photographer. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where I was born and raised. And I lived in Lincoln, I guess up until, all the way through college. And then I went and wandered around for a little bit in my 20s and did some other things. And I came back to Lincoln to get married and raise a family. And so I have been here ever since. So it's a place that I can truly call home. Nebraska, living in Nebraska, I guess like a lot of people maybe, I didn't appreciate it growing up. And it wasn't until I started to get out into the country a little bit, it wasn't until I really moved away and lived in other parts of the country that didn't have that wide open space, that didn't have that huge anchor of sky, where I really started to figure out that this was a place that I guess I like to say is sort of my habitat of the heart. And I think we all have those places. And I don't think that, I think when you look at photographers, you look at writers, you look at artists, they write and photograph and create what they know, what comes from them. And I think the Great Plains, this big, huge, sweeping landscape that you can't put your arms around, is a place that has greatly influenced the work that I do today. And because it's the work of my familiar. And there's an old adage that they say if you can photograph in the plains, you can photograph anywhere because there's nothing out here. And of course, that's terribly far from the truth. But there's a starkness to this place. There's a real sense of openness and vastness and space that I think probably comes through in how I photograph and how I write, although I don't really pay much attention to that. I think it just comes from within. People that have been significant in my photography and writing in the past, I guess, I guess I start with my folks. Really, neither of them, are professional photographers or writers, but they both write well, and they, have an artistic bent to them, and so I think that sort of laid a foundation. But beyond that, photography. I remember I was doing a geography internship at National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C. between undergraduate school and graduate school, and when I wasn't working, I was photographing. And I remember at the end of my summer as an intern, I showed my work to a couple people that I respected a lot in the field. And, they told me, you're doing okay, but you got to do a lot better. And here's some books that you should go look at, and here's some things you should do. And so what I ended up doing is taking those folks' advice. And so there's two photographers. One guy is named Galen Rowell, who's now passed away, and he was a wilderness photographer that was based in California who did really, really lovely work in vast wilderness areas. And I read his book cover to cover. And then another guy named Bill Allard. And Bill Allard has been a National Geographic photographer for 40-some years. And the way he used light, the way he approached his subject was something that I was really drawn to. And so it was those two books and poring over the pages of National Geographic, Nebraskaland magazine, and I'd go to libraries and bookstores, and I would just sit, and not sit in the photography section. I'd sit in the section where particularly I'd look at Impressionist painters. Monet, Manet, Seurat, Degas, all these folks, and I'd just thumb through these pages, and I'd just try to look and see how they saw color, and so that really shaped me, I think. As for writers, I've always read a lot, but I read stuff all across the board. But when I was in college at the university, I worked for a program. I worked my way through school at the Outdoor Adventures program, which is at the university. And what we basically did, I was a staff trip leader, and we took people on trips. outdoor adventure-based trips. So we went rock climbing and whitewater rafting and backpacking and bicycle touring to all these places in the American West. And when you're out in these places and you have all this time, you take books along to read and think, and so, you know, you read things like Edward Abbey and Desert Solitaire, and Aldo Leopold and the Sand County Almanac, and read, you know, the Diaries of John Muir and Wallace Stegner, Wolf Willow, and things like that. And so that's the sort of stuff that I was drawn to, reading-wise. And then once I came back to Nebraska and got married, I started reading more Nebraska authors. I started reading Willa Cather, and I started reading Mari Sandos and John Neihart, and you know, and then Paul Johnsgaard, and gosh, we have great writers here, and so, you know, sort of an eclectic mix, but always sort of in that genre of nature and conservation and wilderness. And then if I really want to escape, you know, it was Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or whomever. You know, I read a lot for my work now because I have to do so much research, and it's hard to find time anymore to sit down and just curl up with with a good book. But those are the early influences, I think. You write because you have to write in school, right? So the first time I really had to write was when I got a job at Nebraskaland magazine, and this was back in 1991, 1992, and I was hired as a staff photographer and writer for the magazine. And you know, I knew I could handle the photography part, but all of a sudden I had to write, you know, and write regularly, but I did, and I guess now I've written over 100 or so feature pieces for that magazine, and I learned from the best of the best. I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize what sort of talent is there at Nebraskaland. It has been there. You know, that magazine's been around since 1929, and there's good folks there, and so, you know, you can't help but have your game elevated when you have to try to write to the level of those writers there and photograph to the level of those photographers there. So, but I'm a very reluctant writer. I don't really like it all that much. When you look back, it's sort of like any writer, when you ask them, I think, you know, a lot of writers need to write because they have to get it out of them. For me, that's photography. Photography, I have to go photograph. I have to get it out. And if I'm not photographing, if I go by for several weeks or several months where I don't have a camera in hand, I lose a part of me. And I just have to go out. And it doesn't matter if I just take a morning and go for a drive with hoarfrost on the trees, like yesterday morning is what I did. And it just sort of, you know, it feeds me. It helps me reconnect. And, you know, and as I've gotten older, I get more satisfaction out of writing and the writing process. I think you get better. It's not become really much easier for me, but when I go back and look at some of the things that I've written, sometimes I sort of run away and hide and say, I can't believe I wrote that. But then there's others in there that, you know, I'm glad that I did it, you know. Well, what inspires me to do what I do today, I guess, you know, bottom line is my wife and I, Patty's children, our kids, Elsa and Emmy. You know, I work in the nature world. I work in the conservation world, and I don't want my children to grow up and someday have handed to them an environment that's a train wreck. I don't want them to grow up and only know about the prairies of the Great Plains by reading it in a book or, you know, going to a museum or going to a zoo. I want them to be able to do the same things that I've been able to do, that most of us in our in our preceding generations have been able to do, and that is go out and engage in nature. And you know, I think a lot of us here in the Great Plains understand and have maybe a more intimate connection with the land than perhaps other parts of the country, because it's our roots, it's who we are and where we're from. But I also think that we have to remind each succeeding generation of our responsibility and why it matters. And we've become increasingly an urban world and an urban society. And so my job and my inspiration is try to reconnect people and remind them of our responsibility to the land, its wild creatures, and to the resources that we all depend on in order to survive. The themes in my work is just trying to, it's conservation, which means, you know, typically I don't go out and just photograph something because it's pretty anymore. You know, I wanted then those images to go to work in some way rather than just be called art, you know, and so you know, getting people to appreciate that lingering wild that's left here in the plains and the beauty in our own backyard that oftentimes gets overlooked or misrepresented or misunderstood by people from outside of the plains, and maybe from some of us that live here now. That's sort of the constant theme that I try to weave into everything I do, and if I can do that in some small way, then you know, I can get up and look at myself in the morning and feel okay. That's for others, I guess, to decide. In the photography end of it, numerous people have said, you know, we can thumb through a magazine and without looking at the names, or thumb through a book and without looking at the names, we can pick out your photographs. I don't see that, and but I think everybody has a style. You know, I think when you start out in a creative field, you're trying to emulate somebody else or other influences. You know, but then after time, those influences just sort of become absorbed, and then something, you know, it gives you the confidence then to be able to sort of let that style come out on your own. So, and I think style probably changes over time, as with life experience and as you get older and so forth. So, so I guess that's how I feel about that. Anybody that'll listen, I guess. So, you know, I've been surprised, you know, by the Great Plains book that was just published. You know, I've talked to a lot of folks that have, you know, that have that book now, and they'll talk to me about what they've got out of that book, and then they'll turn around and tell me what their 5-year-old got out of that book, and that they'll have their kids come up to them at bedtime, and instead of pulling a book off the bookshelf of storybooks, they'll want to sit down with that book. You know, they're not going to be listening to the words, but they want to see the pictures, and they want to know what those pictures mean and what they say. And so, to me, that's about as satisfying a compliment as you could get. And I've gone and given talks on this book in very, you know, urbane, you know, left-leaning crowds in major metropolitan cities, and I've gone and given the exact same talk, you know, in church basements in a small town with people wearing coveralls, seed corn caps, and cowboy hats, and the message is sort of all the same. You know, it's take care of the land, and the land takes care of you, and I think we all have that inside of us. Some of it's laying very latent for some of us, and others of us, you know, make a life on the land every day. And so the audience in conservation is extremely broad, because it affects all of us. You know, we all need clean water, We all need, clean air to breathe. We all need soil to grow the foods that we have and to take care of things. And that's something that transcends, anything and everyone. So, one of the things that I want to bring across to people here in Nebraska and in the Plains in general is what an amazing place we live in, and what an amazing landscape it is. But the problem is that you can't appreciate it from a roadside pullout in 5 minutes. It doesn't knock your socks off at a glance like the Colorado Rockies or the Tetons or the Pacific Northwest. It's a place that you really have to linger. You have to experience it over hours or days or months or years or a lifetime, and it's just like getting to know an old friend. Over those years you peel more layers away and the more beauty that you see, but you have to give it time. And then it becomes every bit as remarkable as any of these other places. And that's the thing that I want people to understand here. We don't have to have an inferiority complex about where we live and about how the Great Plains presents itself. It's not flyover country. It's not one big flat cornfield. It has tremendous value and an incredible natural heritage that we're just beginning to understand. So that's the thing that I'm rooting for. I suggest that people just simply, you have to have a lot of passion. You have to care about what it is that you're writing about or photographing about. It has to be something that you feel here, and then you have to work really, really hard at it, And I think people support you when they know that you have a strong conviction and when they see that passion and when you believe in something, people get behind you, but it doesn't come easy. There's no red easy button out there, and that's what separates a lot of us. There's thousands of great writers and photographers and other artists, but those that tend to rise towards the surface and get seen more are those that are really, they really work their tails off in it, and it oftentimes takes years and years and years and years of toil, but that's a great thing though about having, every individual has their own way of telling a story, bringing something they care about to share with the wider audience. And so we can all stand, there are going to be 10 of us stand in the same spot to photograph a sunset or to write about a sunset, and we can do it all at the same time. And when the darkness closes and the images are captured and the journals are written, each one of those 10 people are going to have their own distinctive voice or their own distinctive image, and that's really cool.
Good afternoon. My name is Meredith McGowan. I am the curator of the Heritage Room, and I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames reading series. We're very excited that this reading series has been around for almost 25 years. The Ames readings are currently held, obviously right now, 2 o'clock on the third Sunday afternoon of the month. I thank you for being here. This is the 187th reading in this series, and I'm glad you're here to enjoy it. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. It is a special collection that's dedicated to promoting and preserving works by and about Nebraska authors. It is, of course, a representative collection because we don't have room for everything, but we do have more than 13,000 volumes over here now, written by more than 3,000 Nebraska authors. We also have information files, magazines, pictures. You can see artwork on the walls here. We have manuscripts. We have several owls that Paul Johnsgard carved that are back behind you, so look as you leave later. By the way, the Heritage Room is not tax supported. It's supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association. We'd like to thank the NLHA for the endowment that was established through their volunteer efforts. And we do invite you to visit the Heritage Room during our regular public service hours. We're open Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3, and we're also open Sunday from 2 to 5. So actually, we're having this reading during our public service hours on Sunday nowadays. The Ames readings, of course, are filmed by Channel 5, and if you are watching this later on Channel 5, we are located on the 3rd floor of Bennett Martin Public Library, 14th and N Streets in downtown Lincoln. Our reader today is Michael Forsberg. He's a photographer and a writer. A Nebraska native, Michael has a BA in geography with an emphasis in environmental studies. He's a professional photographer. His work has appeared in Nebraskaland magazine quite a few times, as well as National Geographic, National Wildlife, Audubon, and Natural History, as well as National Geographic and Smithsonian books, just to name a few. He's a charter member of the North American Nature Photographers Association and a fellow with the International League of Conservation Photographers. Recently, he authored 2 amazing books. In 2004, on Ancient Wings, the Sandhill Crane of North America, and in 2009, Great Plains, America's Lingering Wild. He did have some help with this book about the Great Plains from Dan O'Brien, who wrote essays, from David Wishart, who wrote chapter introductions, and from Ted Kuser, who wrote the foreword. We're happy to have Mike here with us today. If you could help me welcome him, I'd appreciate it.
Wow. Hi. How's everybody? Good. I feel a little naked up here today because, as Meredith said, I'm a photographer and I reluctantly write. And so here I am reading you my writing today with no pictures. So we'll give it a go. What I'm going to do is read to you. I've been working making a living as a photographer for about 15 years, and I started at Nebraskaland magazine. How many folks know or have heard of Nebraskaland? Okay. It's been around since 1929, so it's one of the longest standing state conservation publications in the country, and I was really blessed to have that as my first job because the guys that have been there a long time, and they're some of the best, and it's its own sort of storied tradition, and so I learned by trial and error with a lot of nudging and guidance along the way. So I'm going to start with a few things from Nebraskaland, and then I'll read a piece out of On Ancient Wings, and I'll read a piece out of Great Plains, and then if we have time, I'll finish with something that I wrote just a couple months ago for Prairie Fire. So in Nebraskaland magazine, we don't do this as much anymore, but we used to. We had a place just to write. 2 places, in fact, one in the front of the book was a thing called Notes from the Field, and then in the back of the book there was something called Page 49. Notes from the Field is more experiential, and Page 49 is just sort of self-indulgence, things that we wanted to write about that we couldn't maybe otherwise. So I'm going to start with something with one from Notes from the Field, which was written back, way back in the late 90s, called A Place Without Boundaries. Sugarloaf Butte protrudes like the thumb of a pale giant in the desolate vastness of the Ogallala National Grasslands in Nebraska's northwestern corner. I had been pursuing this chalk-white monolith for most of the morning. Far too long, I thought, now in the scorching heat of a noonday sun. Somewhere back near Whitney, I had turned off the highway and headed due west until the immense grassland table came into view and the formation called Sugarloaf bubbled over the heat waves rimpling on the horizon. Then I abandoned the road map and simply drove towards it. It was midsummer, and I needed solitude, the feeling of easy freedom and peaceful perspective one only gets in the wilderness. It is a drug I don't think I could live without for very long. Back in the city, I can capture it only in small doses, standing in my backyard and closing my eyes during the rise of a sudden wind that drowns out the sirens and incessant ringing of the telephone, or driving on a county road with the windows rolled down, going over hill after hill, farther into the countryside until my watch pulls me back in the opposite direction. But out in the western prairies, there is a deeper, richer freedom, a feeling perhaps truly understood only by those who grow up in the plains. Out there, it is uninterrupted space, a place without boundaries, a place where the view is limited only by how far you can see, a place so vast and empty that finding shade means standing briefly under a cloud shadow rather than under a tree. Unbounded by time or schedule, that is where I found myself, traveling little-used gumbo trail roads, lured to an empty space, an empty place with a lone sentinel I had seen only in pictures. But now I was having trouble getting there. I wanted to travel as the crow flies, but the roads took me at right angles instead, rigidly steering me left then right then left again, parallel to the lone butte on the horizon that seemed to get no closer. With each turn I grew more frustrated, and I cursed each intersection signpost with its numbers that meant nothing to me, intrusive man-made symbols trying to impose order on yet another landscape. The freedom that had been building within me slowly slipped away. I had nearly given up and had grudgingly stopped to pull out the map again when I noticed a homemade marker pointing the way. I drove west down a brittle, deeply rutted track and eventually arrived at a narrow strip of matted grass that served as a pull-off. Beyond, a few hundred yards in the distance, rose Sugarloaf. I wandered through a field of waxy yellow prickly pear cactus flowers surrounding its base, and the feeling of freedom returned. Sugarloaf looked just like the pictures I had seen, a huge remnant figure of stubborn sandstone carved by time, watching over a desolate kingdom of rutted badlands and shortgrass prairie. Other odd-shaped sandstone forms stood far in the distance, but here, Sugarloaf was king. Alone in this sea of grass, I took off my shoes and felt the warmth of the earth, stood there facing the wind and closed my eyes, listening hard but hearing nothing but the wind itself. When I opened my eyes, I looked over miles of prairie and knew it wasn't a dream. At journey's end, the simple emptiness of this place was beginning to give me that sense of solitude that I found so hard to find back home. Then I saw an unlikely sight and realized I wasn't alone. At the butte's highest point, two figures stood silently like cairns marking the summit. A golden eagle and a prairie falcon sat perched side by side. Both noble birds, birds cherished by kings, they, too, seek the solitude of open, often arid country, shunning the closed-in forests and man-inhabited landscapes. Yet in these seemingly endless spaces, they chose to perch side by side, no more than a few feet between them. I wondered why. The coexistence of the two species is ancient and unique. Fossil evidence suggests that they have inhabited roughly the same habitats since their appearance in the late Pleistocene some 10,000 years ago. But like most birds of prey, they are extremely territorial and usually avoid close association with any but their own mates. Prairie falcons protect a breeding territory of about 10 square miles and have been observed driving golden eagles away from their nests. Golden eagles have home ranges more than 3 times as large and have been observing pursuing prairie falcons and stealing their quarry in midair. But oddly enough, the two species have often been found nesting on the same cliff with little observed conflict. I watched them for a half an hour before they took flight. The huge eagle, with its long rounded wings, pumped out a few slow, powerful wing beats and then began soaring on warm thermals rising from the Earth's surface. The falcon, half the eagle's size and shaped like a boomerang in flight, followed in a series of rapid strokes and glides. They rode the random winds, circling upward until they were black specks against the blue sky. As they ascended, I tried to ride with them, visualizing what they might have seen. First, the odd color banded moonscape of the Badlands scraped out of the shortgrass prairie spreading out below them, then the sandstone buttes and ponderosa pine-studded ridges and dissected canyons of the Pine Ridge to the south, and finally, maybe even the deep mauve humps of the Black Hills rising out of the haze far to the north. When they were nearly out of sight, they turned and descended together, alternately soaring and stooping, following each other in spectacular dives, then soaring again until they came to rest back on the summit of the butte. There they sat again like statues until the sun fell low in the sky. To the scientist, there could be many behavioral explanations for this unlikely kinship. Both species often hunt from lookout perches high above the landscape where they use updrafts to gain enough altitude before diving at prey. Both species also use beaters. That is, they sometimes follow other birds of prey, then steal their prize. Another explanation could be play. Recent studies in animal behavior suggest that animals play more often than once was thought. More skeptical scholars could write off this behavior as the anomalous behavior of two young birds who knew no better, or two very old birds who had spent too much time in the sun. But I would like to think they were lured to this rock much like I was, to recapture part of their souls. Some might chide me for this anthropomorphism, but if we were fortunate enough to have wings, I think we too would be inclined to seek out this high point, welcome a companion, and ride the wind unbounded on a warm summer's day, relishing the freedom and peaceful solitude of this vast, empty place. Thank you. Okay, this is a little different. This is a page 49. And I also wrote this in the mid-late 90s. And hopefully some of you can relate to this. This is called the farmer wave. For Cliff, an old friend from grad school and a transplant from the East Coast, the farmer wave was a new and perplexing experience. He was running a day late on his way from Minnesota to Colorado for a spring break ski trip and tried to make up some time by cutting across northern Nebraska on Highway 20. Soon after crossing into the sandhills country of Cherry County from South Dakota, Cliff began to notice something strange. Almost everyone he met, which was mainly cowboys and pickups, he told me, would point a finger up in the air as they passed. His first thought was these fellow travelers, bound by a brotherhood of open road, were warning him of a radar patrol plane hovering somewhere above the highway. But there was no plane in sight. Still, the finger pointing continued. Maybe they were pointing at the top of his car instead. Knowing his roof rack was a piece of junk, sudden visions of $500 compressed Kevlar ski boards skidding over the asphalt at 60 miles per hour raced through his mind. But when Cliff gingerly pulled off to the side of the road, he found his precious cargo still snugly secured, leaving him paranoid and confused about the finger pointers as he crossed the state line and drove into the Wyoming night. Memories of Cliff's brief visit through less-traveled Nebraska came back to life a few summers ago when, out of habit, I casually waved at a person watering a lawn as Cliff and I drove to lunch through a lazy neighborhood in South St. Paul, Minnesota. Cliff recognized my wave as the same gesture that almost drove him to insanity the previous winter. He demanded an explanation. What he saw was the farmer wave, I told him, merely a gesture of acknowledgement often performed by friends and strangers alike as they meet on the less-traveled rural roads of Nebraska. His face was blank. If he spent enough time in Nebraska, I said, he would understand and soon be doing the same thing too. But coming from New York, Cliff couldn't quite grasp why strangers would wave at each other. If he tried that where he grew up, he said, he'd probably get mugged. There is a mystique about the farmer wave, that gesture that lures us forward in the driver's seat and drapes our hands over the steering wheel, constantly ready to wave at strangers. So last year, I decided to study the phenomenon and shed some light on what has become as much a reflex to many Nebraskans as taking off their hats for the national anthem at a football game. The name farmer wave was coined by the son of a farmer who once told me that's what the gesture was called, and I instantly considered him an authority on the matter. That name has met some resistance from a few ranchers, however, so I'm willing to call it the wave for short. Variations. The wave has innumerable variations based on gender and age, but for many drivers it is an art form. Men usually drape one hand over the other on the steering wheel and casually raise a finger or two in a one and two and rhythm. Women usually perform it with hands bolted at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel and shoot up a cautionary index finger like an exclamation point. Older folks of either gender usually lift an entire arm with enthusiastic vigor. All account for artful variations of the wave. Demographics and vehicle types. In the spirit of research, I've made a conscious effort on some trips to wave only at those who wave at me first. Then on the way back home, I initiate the wave. Overwhelmingly, I found men initiate the wave far more often than women. People wearing seed corn caps or cowboy hats wave more often than those without. UPS drivers and rural mail carriers always wave first. So do school bus drivers and the drivers of 18-wheelers hauling livestock. People driving trucks are more apt to wave than those driving cars. If it's a beat-up, muddy Ford or Chevy, the odds also increase. Almost anyone in rural Nebraska will return the wave. Geography. The wave frequency increases in proportion to your distance from major population centers. It is certainly prevalent in most small towns. In the Sandhills counties, the frequency goes off the chart. It also runs rampant along the Nebraska-Kansas border. Etiquette. I've learned some unwritten rules, etiquette if you will, from veteran drivers with decades of experience. You should always wave if someone waves at you first. If the sun is in your eyes and you can't see the driver of an oncoming car, assume they are waving and wave back. The only exception is, of course, if you are pouring coffee or adjusting the heat vent. Then a generous head nod will suffice. As with the mystery surrounding boots upside down on fence posts, no one seems to know for sure why the wave is practiced with such fervor in Nebraska. One man told me he had a friend who broke his index finger and never bothered to see a doctor. Now when he rests his hands on the steering wheel, the index finger sticks up in a permanent wave. At first it was a local joke, but now everyone in town does it. Another man waves at everybody. His wife made him buy glasses because friends kept asking her why he was no longer returning greetings on the road. In fact, his eyesight had gotten so bad he just couldn't see well enough to make out that the other drivers were waving at him, so now he waves at everyone. Like the humidity in July, the farmer wave tells me I'm in Nebraska. I've tried it in other states, but like my buddy Cliff, they usually only offer stares in return. Cliff and I lost track of each other about a year ago. He's probably back east, cursing traffic and playing the stock market. Living in the Midwest wasn't his style, he told me once. But I know someday he'll be lured back to this fair state. So do me a favor. If you see a Mazda RX-7 with New York plates hauling skis on a roof rack, give him the wave. Who knows? This time he might just wave back. Okay. I think we're at the point now where I've read more to you guys than I've read to anybody else in my entire life. These are the bound editions of Nebraskaland magazine. I'm going to read this is a lot of what I've done for Nebraskaland has been essays, natural history essays, mostly just text to fill space for pictures, but more than that. This is one called The Autumn Forest. Here's a picture of the autumn forest. And what I try to do writing is try to do the same thing as I do photographing. And that is just to try to put people there, try to connect them with that with that landscape. I wished I could take everybody with when I go to these places, but obviously that doesn't work very well with the sort of work that I do. And I always try to tie in natural history to it too, because I want people to learn about some of these places, some of these creatures, in much the same way that I learn. Because every time I go out, you think you know a little bit about something, and you realize when you come back that there was a lot you didn't know, and you end up learning a lot along the way. So this is an essay about the autumn forest. From its ridgetop post anchored high on a Missouri River bluff, a stately bur oak stares out over an endless quilt of fall color. It watches for days on end in the weakening summer sun as the gentle wave of warmth travels southward like a colorful cloud over the faces of its siblings in the valley below. The old oak has stood here for decades, and it knows these colors well. With them come complex changes in the forest. Maturity slips into old age, and the forest is transformed. To many of us, fall color is simply a Sunday drive in the country, an annual ritual by which we pay homage to nature's grand palette of reds and oranges and yellows and browns. These are the colors that soothe our thoughts with warm summer memories and prepare us for the onset of cold. Each fall we compare that year's color with last, and maybe with the years before that. A month or two later we mourn the loss of these colors, and in our minds, autumn is gone. But somehow we just don't get it, the old oak on the ridgetop might say, as its gnarled, twisted arms send out buff-colored messengers to ride the north wind. In the forest, autumn lasts beyond the fleeting colors, far into December, when the sun's orbit reaches its southernmost destination over the Tropic of Capricorn to warm the other end of the world. It is a time of anxiety, rapid migration, and vacancy, of quiet, dormancy, and rest. This is the autumn the old oak knows. But first it is color. Somewhere deep in the heart of Indian Cave State Park, the transformation begins in early September. The color red, caused by an overproduction of sugars and leaf cells, first begins to give life to fading greens. Along slender fingers of ridgetop prairie, burgundy courses through the veins of smooth sumac, and tree-climbing vines like Virginia creeper and wild grape become fine scarlet and maroon necklaces against the dull brown trunks of bur oak and bitternut hickories. In the openings on the forest floor, dense pockets of poison ivy reveal themselves as bright red-orange patterns of dappled sunlight. Next, yellow appears. Imprisoned all summer by chlorophyll's powerful greens, it is set free in broad brushstrokes of gold along the Missouri River floodplain and open forests of cottonwood and green ash. Then it climbs the lower bluff slopes through stands of hackberry and immense basswood trees, and finally saturates the hillsides reaching honey locust, box elder, and hop hornbeam. Giving in to the shortening hours of sunlight and lingering cool nights, the mighty oaks are last to join in this procession of color. 8 species of oaks are present here, and they fill out the canopy with a mosaic of dark reds and tans and browns. By mid-October, the colors are at their peak. But peaks in nature only seem permanent if they are mountains. Soon, prevailing north winds will coax the rigid stems from the skin of their branches, and millions of leaves from thousands of trees will tumble to their permanent resting place on the forest floor. There, one Native American legend says, they will gather and tell endless stories of the forest. If the oaks were a people, they would know their stories well and remember all the autumns of the forest. Their newly fallen leaves would listen to the stories of those that fell before them and hear of the warm and rainy autumns that produced only dull, muted colors, and of the early ice storms that killed the tissue of their branches before they had time to build defenses to protect themselves from the cold. Maybe some would remember the unstable course of the once mighty Missouri River before channelization and the plow, when its floodplain was an extensive system of marshlands, oxbows, and riparian forests, or when expeditions of explorers, Lewis and Clark, Nicollet and Warren, traveled up its meandering banks. If the roots of these trees listened to the soils, they would hear stories of autumn when the great armies of deciduous trees first arrived on these bluffs, traveling north along river courses from the eastern hardwood forests of the Allegheny and Cumberland plateaus, until they were suppressed by the forces of prairie fire and drought along the eastern edge of the plains. Here their ancestors put down roots in rich yellow-brown lush soils on bluffs formed long ago from wind-blown silt deposited by great glacial meltwaters of a young Missouri River at the end of the last ice age. If the roots reached far enough, they could listen to the rocks, who remembered when there were no autumns, only ice, when continental glaciers left their till of clay, silt, sand, and boulders piled high upon bedrock sandstone formed from ancient coastal riverbeds, and limestone shales laid down when eastern Nebraska was an open sea. By late October, the fiery colors wane over the Missouri River bluffs of Indian Cave. Now, shallow pools fed by spring seeps reflect only somber shades of umber, ochre, and brown. It is a time when there are as many leaves on the ground as in the forest canopy. The colors are poignant but monotonous, broken only by lingering greens of pawpaw and the vagrant yellows of basswood on the valley floor. There is a different feel to the late October forest. Squirrels gather food for their caches more urgently, rarely stopping to chatter or play. Scores of migrating songbirds, their voices usually pure and melodic, now sound loud and edgy as they flit nervously from tree to tree. When periodic gusts begin to howl down the valley and bend the trees, the forest seems to pause and listen, suspended in an eerie, awkward silence long after the wind has passed, as if waiting for some inaudible message warning of winter's rapid approach. If October is color, then November is wind. It streaks out of the north under sullen gray skies and chases the last of the Canada geese southward down the Missouri River flyway. It meticulously carves its way down hillsides, weaving through wood-choked ravines and harassing the branches of the forest canopy until it breaks the spirit of the last stubborn leaves. Then it sneaks along the forest floor into stream valleys and creek bottoms, wandering through an invisible dome of dense, dank cold. Sometimes it brings a weak cold front that hasn't summoned up enough courage to produce a storm, dropping fleeting showers of snow and sleet, or on warmer days, cold rain. The November wind uncovers nests and dense thickets of wild plum and squirrel colonies high in the forest canopy and allows from the birds of the forest. The last of the summer songbirds have pushed south by a freezing rain. Soon, the dampness of the cold gray skies will send a blanket of wet snow over the ridges and valleys of the Missouri River bluffs of southeastern Nebraska. The oak trees will take note of this autumn, and the forest will finally sleep. That's that one. That's sort of a depressing one to read in this winter, I suppose, as we're Okay, let's see here. I am 2:30? Okay. I'm going to read something actually from the Great Plains book. As Meredith said, on the Crane book, I wrote everything in the Crane book except the introduction, and I went on about a 5-year, 13-location journey up and down the North American continent. And each place that I went to document the lives of cranes, I wrote an essay about that place. In the Great Plains book, I didn't feel like I had the chops to write about the Great Plains, because the Great Plains has such a great stew of writers, and it's also such an amazing place that I think I really wanted voices that had lived and loved and lost on the prairie, been around the block more than once, and I didn't feel like I had that in me. So I had a lot of help. David Wishart, my old geography professor and advisor at the University of Nebraska, was gracious enough to come on board. Dan O'Brien, who's a wonderful Western literary voice who lives in western South Dakota, had a real, Dan writes very honestly, very passionately, very edgy. He's like any number of other ranchers that I've met out there, and I really wanted Dan's voice in this. So those guys carry the load of the writing in here. And then, of course, anything Kuzer does is wonderful, and he wrote a really beautiful foreword for this. So what my offer was to this was about four or five different field stories. So what I'm going to read you is one of those field stories, and if I can find it here. It takes place in the Flint Hills of Kansas, just south of us, about 2.5 hours near, south of Manhattan a little ways is where this was. It's just simply called Field Journal, Illinois Creek, Flint Hills of Kansas, July 8th, 2007. Today is my third day photographing underwater in the land of Oz. I'm trying to capture on camera the small, beautiful native fish that live out their lives in the clear streams rolling off the tall grass tabletops of the Flint Hills in eastern Kansas. These are the streams and creeks most people seldom notice or think about as they drive over them on a county road. But I'll never not notice them again. The water of these creeks is arguably clearer than any in the Great Plains, thanks to the creek's limestone bottoms and to the still intact tallgrass prairie surrounding them. Entering their underwater realm is like entering another world. First, a supreme silence envelops you with a feeling as comforting as a warm blanket on a cold winter's night. Then there's the soft, almost buttery quality of light, refracted by the water above and reflected by the cream-colored limestone below. Finally, you notice the rich diversity of the life itself, which is everywhere. Submerged just below the surface in a few feet of water, pushing off the bottom with my hands and propelling myself forward ever so slowly and quietly, I move from pool to riffle to pool. I can see crayfish backpedal into dark corners, and mossy-backed turtles lurking on the edge of undercut banks, and schools of fish no bigger than my pinky, darting this way and that in and out of the current. Their magnificent colors flash every time they hit a spotlight of noonday sun streaking through the canopy of trees. I've spent an hour or so in the water when I surface to defog my mask and readjust a plate-sized slab of limestone I had shoved into the front of my wetsuit as ballast. I look up and I see a man wearing a cowboy hat and boots standing on the high bank staring down at me. Through my fog-stained mask, I can see he's tall, lean, and weathered by the sun. He has a fence-fixing tool in one hand and a roll of baling wire in the other. "Hi," I say. "Hello," he says back with a nod and a puzzled look on his face. "Well, I bet you don't see someone in a wetsuit and a mask snorkeling in this creek every day," I offer, not knowing what else to say. "Nope." "Then I suppose you're probably wondering what the heck I'm doing," I say as I pull myself up on a gravel bar near the bank and take off my mask so he can see my face. "You could say that." "Well, I'm photographing fish." He looks at me funny and takes a step back. "You mean suckers?" he asks, using the generic angler's term for any fish not worth catching. "Well, yeah, there are probably a couple suckers in here, but I'm trying to photograph other fish, like daces and darters and sunfish and shiners and even Topeka shiners, the endangered ones, the natives that are supposed to be in these prairie streams." He says with a nod. Then there's an awkward silence. I don't think he believes me. "Would you like to see a few pictures?" Okay. He says, somewhat surprised, and he takes a step forward. I shake off some water and meet him halfway up the bank. Taking the digital camera out of an underwater housing, I show him some images on the back of the screen. The fish, which today are schooled up in the current at the head of a couple deep pools, are in prime spawning colors, and every bit as colorful as a rainbow or a coral reef. He takes a long look. "Those are in this creek?" he asked as his face creases with a slight grin. "Yep, there and over there." I point to the places in the stream I'd just taken the photographs. "Pretty cool, huh?" I say. "Yeah." "What are those fish again?" So I tell him I've just learned what these fish are myself, and that I honestly don't know much about fish other than what I can catch with a worm and a bobber. I also admit that I've rarely photographed underwater before, but I explain that here in the prairies we tend to think a lot about birds and grass and the land above, but not much about fish in the waters below. That these native fish species are here and thriving is a sign of water quality, I explain, and that translates in large measure to the good stewardship of the ranchers in these hills, people like him. So you live around here, I ask? We lease the pasture over there. My family has been around here for many generations. Was your family one of the first to settle in this area? Not the first, but pretty close. Probably been here about as long as that old tree. He points to a huge old cedar guarding the edge of a rock face on the opposite bank, where a thin waterfall cascades into the creek. Our conversation quickly fades as we stand there, looking at the old tree, watching the water slide down the rock wall, and trying to imagine the fish in the deep, dark pools of the creek. Well, I should fix that fence, he says. High water pushed it over last week. Need any help, I offer? Nope, but thanks. With that, he walks back to his pickup to grab another tool, and I put on my mask and slide down the bank into the creek. For the next several minutes, I can hear the muffled tamping sounds of fence posts being reset into the creek bottom as I search underwater for the brilliant-colored, long-eared sunfish lurking around their spawning beds near the crown of a fallen tree. A moment later, the tamping sounds stop. I emerge again to defog my mask and look downstream. The fence is fixed. The rancher gone. Here's one of those pictures. Hard to believe, right? Yeah. They're all about this big. You've seen the pictures, I'm sure, wildlife films of salmon spawning. These creeks where you can see the red from far off in the distance. Well, you can see the red far off in the distance with these guys too, but it's little balls of color. Just like about as big as a beach ball maybe. And it's fascinating. I'm gonna end with something I wrote for Prairie Fire newspaper recently called Time. People oftentimes ask me what your life is like out on the road, and I think the perception is often that photographers ride in with a big white hat on a white horse, and we take beautiful pictures, and everything's great, and people laud you with compliments, and your whole world is the oyster and all that stuff. And I'm the luckiest guy in the world to be able to love to do what I do, but it doesn't come without costs, and it doesn't come without a lot of trials and tribulations and second guessing and of yourself and everything that matters to you. So this came out as sort of in a roundabout way, an essay on the Great Plains. I'm going to read it for you here. I'm going to get a glass of water first. Okay. Niobrara River sunrise. Click. 1/2 second. Bobcat walking along a game trail at sundown. Click. 1/60th of a second. Bison at night in a lightning storm. Click. 5.8 seconds. One evening after the rest of my family was asleep, I turned to the computer, a calculator, and with my shaky memory of 6th grade math, began adding up the recorded shutter speeds from each of the 180 photos that appear in my book, Great Plains, America's Lingering Wild. 2 hours later, I had an answer. 10 seconds. To be honest, I'm not quite sure why I wanted to do this, other than lately I've been thinking a lot about time. It is these 10 seconds that represent a several-year journey, trying to put a face to the wildlife and native landscapes that still survive in this million-square-mile region that many of us call home. Today, North America's Great Plains is an altered and fragmented natural landscape. It has been called the continent's most endangered ecosystem. As a photographer, my goal was to try and stitch this ecosystem back together in pictures, shed light on complex conservation challenges, and build appreciation for the wild that still remains in this often overlooked heartland. Since that night, I have kept wondering, are those 10 seconds enough time to make a case? As photographers, we think a lot about time. Our craft is to capture time in a box. But in book projects like this one, time turns the tables and captures you. There's planning time and research time, field time and waiting time, travel time, making time, buying time, deadline time. Time is money, time away, family time, lost time, other people's time, historic time, here and now time, future time, running out of time. Time follows you like a constant shadow. It consumes you. Looking forward at the beginning of a project, time can seem endless. Looking back after you are finished, you wonder where all the time has gone, as if you had little time at all. For years, this book had been a distant dream, but the timing was never right to go at it full throttle until the summer of 2005 when time freed up. Proposals were written, funding was found, and creative support fell together. By fall, I was hitting the road following a schedule that would keep me gone 6 months a year for the next 3+ years. I had to be done by the end of 2008. It would be a race against time. On paper, I was going to go everywhere in these vast Great Plains. No stone or piece of prairie sod would be left unturned. But when I showed my field schedule to those close to me, they would smile, call it ambitious, then wish me well. I know their well wishes were genuine, but deep down inside I knew they thought I was nuts. I was going to struggle with time, and they were right. Time was a constant battle in the field. It's easy to lay out a schedule in the comfort of your office or while driving down the freedom of the open road with not a care in the world. You figure in early May you will work sage grouse on their strutting grounds in eastern Wyoming, then slip up to northwestern South Dakota to photograph golden eagles at the nest, then slide over to North Dakota to catch ducks hatching chicks in the Missouri Coteau. You make the phone calls, get permissions, pack your bags, and hit the road. But rarely does anything go as planned. In Wyoming, the sage grouse are strutting, but the pickup isn't starting because the alternator quit and took 3 days to get fixed. In South Dakota, the eagles decided to use another nest this year, tucked under a dark ledge on an adjacent cliff far out of photography range. In North Dakota, the ducks are hatching, but constant heavy rains make it nearly impossible to photograph in the field. But all those things come with the job. After 15 years of doing this for a living, you come to expect the unexpected. You learn to adapt, improvise, and overcome. But what's more difficult to overcome is when you get a lump in your throat, when your daughter races you down the end of the block as you leave and you realize you will be home just 2 weeks in the next 2 months. It's no big deal when you're single and your address is a P.O. box. But now, more hours in the field mean less hours at home as a husband and a father. You rationalize being gone by promising your family to never miss birthdays or anniversaries, swim meets or school band performances, Mother's or Father's Day, Thanksgiving or Christmas. You find yourself delaying your trip a day after spending 3 days getting completely packed just because you don't want to leave. You drive everywhere knowing that even if you are as far away as Medicine Hat, Alberta, you can still be home from anywhere in less than 24 hours. Sometimes you leave from a field location early, spending only a week rather than the 2 weeks you had planned, knowing that if you stayed you would probably make even better pictures, but saying that what you had got has got to be good enough. It's time to get home. When the fieldwork officially ended in late 2008, I had traveled roughly 100,000 miles to 12 states in the U.S. and 3 provinces in Canada and Mexico. I had taken over 30,000 images of everything from tiny native minnows to mountain lions. Although I was not able to go to every place I'd planned, I was able to photograph most of the subjects I had hoped to cover, and sometimes my wife Patty and our girls Elsa and Emmy were able to come along too. Then we began a race against another deadline. During the next 6 months, writers and editors finished and shaped text, images were selected, layouts were forged, facts were checked, captions were written and rewritten, maps were created, and a publisher and printer were brought on board. By mid-May, it was done and out the door, just in the nick of time. The books arrived in mid-September. When I gave one to a close friend of mine a few days ago, he asked me a point-blank question. "After all this," he said, as he held up the book in his hand, "has time run out on the Great Plains as an ecosystem?" Good question. Over the span of this project, I have learned that the Great Plains and its natural processes need large landscapes over which to function. Yet as an ecosystem, it has been chopped off at the knees in the last century. In many places today, it is in disrepair. The effects of our actions, whether from our lack of knowledge or our indifference or greed, have resulted in depleted aquifers, invasive species, drastic loss of habitat, losses of wildlife populations, or loss of species altogether, and the list goes on. On the one hand, I told him, I fear that we are in danger of losing a natural heritage that we have barely gotten to know or completely understand. I worry that today, in a more urbanized world, further removed from the land, we increasingly gauge its value only by what can be extracted from it for a profit, rather than by realizing the intrinsic value of the land itself. On the other hand, if there is one thing we can count on as a constant in the Great Plains, it is change. Humankind has changed this natural landscape more in the last 150 years than it has throughout the rest of its human history, and it hasn't always been pretty. But humans, for better or worse, are part of the ecosystem too. And we also have great capacity for restoration and recovery and renewal. Here on the plains, I have seen it firsthand. As we move forward, the Great Plains will continue to be a working landscape that helps feed the world and will increasingly be called upon to help fuel our energy needs. But will we as a culture also decide to find equal value and virtue in protecting and restoring our plains' rich natural heritage, its amazing diversity, and all the ecosystem services that its nature provides? In the long view, can the Great Plains function as working wilderness? The contents of this book and its 10 seconds of photographs are not sufficient enough to answer these questions, but perhaps it is a sufficient start to a conversation. Time is short. Let's not waste it.